Yeah, Gaza was already in a pretty difficult humanitarian situation even before the events of the 2014 summer. Gaza has been, for a number of years now, under some would call it a blockade, which means that the flow of goods is regulated by Israel in and out of Gaza, and so the borders are still closed in that way, so very much limits on what can come in and out. And people also cannot go in and out freely. So you have people who are in this territory, a territory that's very densely populated, one of the most densely populated places on Earth, with very limited access to certain necessary goods coming in and out, including different kinds of food products, different kinds of development materials, etc. So Gaza has been suffering in those ways. Also from water shortages and sanitary issues in the past as well. And also still just from rebuilding from previous Gaza wars in 2009 and 2012. So Gaza within Palestine, even before 2014, was already struggling, to say the least. With that said, people have been very creative and entrepreneurial in terms of creating opportunities in Gaza despite those restrictions. After 2014, after the summer of 2014, obviously much more dire. We heard obviously a lot about the loss of life during the conflict. Over 2,100 people were killed. A high percentage of them estimated to be civilians, estimated about 75% by the UN. So obviously still a lot of grieving just over that loss of life, and many people who are also injured who are still trying to get adequate medical care from that. The level of destruction in Gaza was very intense this summer. There were over 5,000 airstrikes carried out on a territory that's smaller than the island of Montreal if you kind of superimpose them. So massive infrastructure damage. At least 20,000 homes and houses were destroyed, which means that about 100,000 people are still living without housing or in some kind of temporary shelter situation. The ceasefire definitely obviously changed the dynamic there, and just for most people by that point, just having the ceasefire was something that was necessary. The ceasefire itself didn't really include many conditions to change the long-term situation that is currently being discussed and debated, and hopefully this fall there will be some final answers that are kind of coming out of the ceasefire about how to handle the borders in the future, having a stronger PA presence, for example, having monitoring of some of these reconstruction materials coming in.
And
when the territories were first occupied by Israel in 1967, movement across the border was fairly open. Trade was fairly open, and in fact there were very large numbers of Palestinians who worked within Israel. That began to be restricted a little in 1991, partly because of the tail end of the First Intifada, partly because of the Iraq-Kuwait War. Then after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority in 94, there were a series of suicide bombings in 95, 96, which led Israel to increasingly prevent Palestinian labor from working within Israel, and to begin a little bit later to restrict some goods going into Gaza. The very severe closure policies on Gaza were introduced following the election of Hamas in 2006, and then its takeover of the Gaza Strip in 2007. And the Second Intifada also led to the construction of the separation barrier, or the wall between Israeli-controlled areas, Israel and the West Bank, and Palestinian areas.
Groups, and the existence that so many people in Gaza rely on UNRWA for basic services, the fact that most people are unemployed, the fact that the majority of the population is under 20 in Gaza, the fact that these humanitarian groups aren't, there's no foreseeable end to their existence there, demonstrates how untenable the situation is in Gaza. I think that is where I feel more comfortable responding. But yeah, I mean, I think there's no economic viability in Gaza.
The economic crisis in Gaza is directly a function of Israeli and Egyptian policy. I mean, we have to make it clear it's both, because the Egyptians equally prohibit goods from moving across the border. And Israel has had a quite explicit, to be very clear about it, calculated policy of trying to hurt Gaza as a way of undercutting support for Hamas. They have carefully calibrated it so that no one's starving. They can rely on the UN to address that need. There's currently over 800,000 people in Gaza that receive emergency food from the UN. So Israel has been able to control the movement of goods in and out of Gaza to create an economic crisis that does not create serious threats to life and survival. So no one is starving to death in Gaza. And there's no requirement in international law that you have to trade with an enemy entity, but if there is a prohibition on collective punishment. And so to the extent that what we see is collective punishment of Gaza because of how it voted or because of who it governs it, I think that that's legally problematic under international law. I do not think that Israel is going to lift closure. Okay. I think it's going to tweak closure. I think that the policy reasons that led it to impose these restrictions on Gaza are not going to disappear.
After the Gaza war, Hamas has really gotten a bump in political popularity. Right after the ceasefire, their popularity was higher than it had been in years, I think close to 90%. That sense has tempered, and it's starting to fall a little bit, but still almost twice as high of popularity rates as they were before the war. Having said that, part of the conditions for whatever the final agreements for the ceasefire are going to be will involve a PA presence. So again, Hamas was politically strengthened, but still very economically weak. Though Canada has been seen as aligning more strongly with Israel in a lot of their foreign policy, still aid given to the Palestinian Authority for humanitarian aid. There's about $60 million per year given to the Palestinian Authority. However, there's about $1.5 billion in trade relations between Israel and Canada that really underscores that relationship. Canada and Israel have a free trade agreement that's very important to both of them. Anyway, about $1.5 billion total in trade, and that underscores that relationship a lot. Harper was in Israel earlier this year and gave a speech that also reaffirmed Canada's commitment to Israel and stated that commitment as a moral imperative as well as an interest-based one. Having said that, Canada's official foreign policy on this has stayed pretty consistent. In addition to directly supporting security for the state of Israel, also supports a comprehensive peace agreement with a two-state solution, with a secure peace for Palestinians, with addressing the separation barrier and settlement. So the actual official policy for Canada under the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade has stayed pretty consistent and is a bit more even-handed, we could say, than some of the louder political rhetoric that you see coming from the current government.
Okay. Demilitarized McGill is opposed to military research, development of military technology, and more broadly to warfare, especially warfare in colonialist or imperialist contexts. And this is absolutely something that can be applied to the case of Israel and Palestine, where in very clear ways the Israeli state has been engaged in many colonialist wars in order to maintain its position, in order to maintain its borders. So I think certainly this is something that we're opposed to.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely been long-standing Canadian involvement in the provision of military technology to Israel, Canadian companies involved and so forth. It's also worth noting that in terms of foreign policies, Canada's foreign policy in support of Israel, which has become stronger and stronger, especially since the election of Stephen Harper's government, plays a big role in Israel being able to maintain its position. It gives it this sort of veneer of international legitimacy. So what the J motion that's just recently been ratified online does is mean that SMU has an official position on this issue and can support campaigns, whether that be Demilitarized McGill or other efforts that are working to oppose the development of military technology on campus. This is important for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I think that while these are really big issues, and they're issues that have global reach, that are very interconnected between different institutions, it is important to challenge them on the local levels where they occur, and McGill University and many other universities are certainly places to do that. And secondly as well, I think that, counter to a lot of the arguments that are made that, there's a student union, what can they really do about this? It's important to remember that a lot of important social movements and social progress has been pushed forward by students, by student associations, student movements, and certainly in the case of anti-war, anti-imperialist movements, that's also been the case. There's been, obviously one well-known example would be the Vietnam War, where it was a student movement that really drove forward the opposition to that war in the US. I think ending all military research at McGill is a difficult task, and one that I don't think will be achieved anytime in the very near future. But certainly I think we've already seen move in that direction. I think by making people aware of these issues and by provoking debate and discussion around them, it does force the university to reconsider. We've seen recently they've launched this review of research policy. We'll see exactly what comes out of that later down the road, but certainly the fact that they felt they do have to somehow respond to this is a first step. And as well, we do know that the kind of attention, and often negative attention, that people doing military research have gotten has also caused a lot of debate within their own academic departments and faculties about what kind of research is being done.
I mean, from Harper to Mulcair, Trudeau somewhere in the middle, or however you want to put Mulcair and Trudeau one over the other, like, they all echo the exact same line, whereas historically maybe the NDP would have been like, it might be good for Israel to stop bombing. The NDP message in the early days of this invasion was just like self-defense, Israel, etc. So within the three dominant political parties, it's completely supportive of the Israeli project in any way. But like Abbas hasn't had an election in 10 years or something, or 9 years. Abbas wasn't elected in Gaza, and Abbas does not have any representation amongst refugee populations, for example. The 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 million Palestinians living in neighboring countries or around the world, right? So like, any truly, in my estimation, and again, not speaking, Palestinians need to make that decision for themselves, but I think most, from friends and political groups and people that I've spoken to, Abbas is not seen as a representative of the people's will, given that he wasn't elected in one of the territories. There's no elections outside of contemporary Israel and the territories. So yeah, I think like an election might be a useful start.
The Gaza war obviously had a lot of coverage, and I think social media really played a role in getting some of the images of what happened in Gaza this time out, where I think it's a bit of a contrast to, say, the 2009 Operation Cast-led Gaza war, where the media access was a bit more limited to some degree. So I do think Gaza 2014 had a bit more play, although I think the coverage and again the social media aspect was sort of a double-edged sword.
Also to speak to its own constituency. So if you were following the social media that was critical of the destruction Israel was bringing about in Gaza, then you were reinforced in your view about how appalling the war was. If you followed the social media, the Twitter, the Facebook accounts of people who supported IDF actions, then you got a version of the story which was all about Palestinian atrocities and how wonderful the IDF was being. So social media, rather than, in a sense, democratizing information, can contribute to what we call confirmation bias. That is to say, you go and hunt out you hunt out sources which reinforce your preconceived views, so rather than sort of expanding your mind in a way it contracts. Similar, so to some extent there was a artificial balance or being placed on a very unbalanced war. That's true of media coverage of a lot of things. Global warming, perfect example,
For example, so social media to a certain extent can help, maybe mobilize a lot of people. It can help as a call to action, but social media is limiting in its aspect because it is, to a certain extent, an elitist form of communication. Not a lot of people have access to the internet, especially in areas such as Egypt and the West Bank. This is also very much due to the occupation, how the occupation works, in restricting the population's access to a lot of resources. But I feel like social media can help, as I said, to mobilize a lot of people. It doesn't help to a very large extent in organizing a lot of people from different backgrounds. It organized a lot of people from the same background, I feel. Intellectuals, students who have access to the internet, for example, students who are active on Facebook, Twitter, whatever. As far as changing people's opinions about the conflict, it does have a major role, because to underestimate social media and sort of shaping public opinion is to underestimate media's entire role in shaping public opinion. And to go back to how propaganda was disseminated in the US in the 60s, for example, with the Vietnam War, in 2003 with the Iraq invasion, the media is very much used to sway public opinion, and governments do know the extent to which that goes. This is why Israel, in its last two wars in Gaza, for example, targeted TV stations, radio stations first, because it knows the extent to which TV stations in the West Bank can sway public opinion against Israel. And so it does that in a very strategic move. I feel like, especially with the last Gaza war, people who were sort of on the fence about the occupation sort of quote-unquote came out as supporting the Palestinian side because of a lot of social media activism that was happening. I'm very wary of saying that all social media activism is quote-unquote collectivism, because that underestimates, for example, the journalist's role in disseminating articles on social media, that underestimates a lot of pro-Palestine solidarity collectives that do have a strong presence on social media and try to mobilize people through that sort of sphere. It's very important because a lot of people who hold sway and a lot of people who sort of monitor social media can see how that's sort of like changing public opinion. I feel like anonymity can go either way. Because especially when it comes to Palestine solidarity work, the internet is a very hostile place. Not to mention that people can very easily track you down on Facebook and can verbally or physically abuse you. And that's happened with a lot of SPHR members during the motion that was passed in 2009 after the 2008-2009 Gaza war. So it does go both ways. It also gives a lot of anti-Semites and a lot of sort of people who work against the Palestinian cause sway. When being anonymous, they can do whatever they want, or they can say whatever they want. As far as nonviolent solidarity actions go, this is a very good step in the right direction. You can already see BDS having an impact, especially during the Gaza war last summer. A bunch of EU parliamentarians, for example, have written a letter for the EU to divest from companies complicit in Israeli occupation and from companies operating in Israel itself. So this is not just a grassroots sort of like very small scope, this is a very wide scope. And this is a great way of tackling all sort of variables in the occupation. This puts a strain on Israel's economy, this makes a lot of Israelis even think about what their country is complicit in. As far as different sort of boycotts go, you have the economic boycott, you have the academic boycott, and cultural boycott of Israel. Those can be sort of different or intermingled, I feel. The economic boycott is pretty straightforward. You divest from companies complicit in Israeli occupation or companies who fund the Israeli occupation. As far as like cultural boycotts go, this is a great, I mean, Pink Floyd has refused to play in Israel a lot of times because they know what it means to play in Israel. And then like musicians go on, for example, musicians such as Talib Kweli also refuse to play in Israel and go on to raise awareness about what's happening in Israel and disseminate that as well. So there are two sides to that. The academic boycott, I feel, is the most contentious issue regarding the boycotts. Personally for me, it's not. It's pretty straightforward. A lot of Israeli academics even have come out in support of the academic boycott of Israel, knowing that their state and that academia in Israel plays a major role in perpetuating propaganda. I feel like the economic boycott is the most, personally I feel like it's the most, I don't know, sort of concrete way at dealing with occupation because it has concrete outcomes.
And just more importantly, it's created a bit more discourse and conversation about, why a certain company or product might be problematic and where does it trace back to. And I think just with a lot of our consumption, just trying to be more aware of where things are coming from, whether it's this conflict or another, and be more aware of that. I don't think BDS is something that everyone feels comfortable with, and I definitely respect that as well. I think it works for a lot of people. I think it's one form of activism, but I don't think it's the most comfortable for a lot of people, especially those who might see it as perhaps limiting their ability to engage and to discuss and to have an open dialogue on this issue. So again, for some people it works great, for others there's a lot of other different forms that I think are more comfortable and also just as necessary.
I certainly don't have any moral objection in general to using boycott, disinvestment, sanction campaigns against countries to get them to change their foreign policies. South Africa would be a perfect example. I think the question with BDS on Israel is whether it moves you towards that desired goal of sort of raising the cost for Israel of occupation policy. And I'm not sure that BDS does for two sets of reasons. One is I do not think it's as clearly focused as it should be. So it sends a message which the Jewish community and Israelis find confusing, whether Israel is being punished for being Israel or whether it's particular things that have to do with the occupied territories. So some of the BDS targets like SodaStream are clearly, you have a factory in the occupied territories, that's wrong and illegal under international law, that's clear enough. Others seem to be boycotting Israel because it's Israel. And then that ties into the second factor, which is given the history of Israel and given the history of Jewish communities and their history of anti-Semitism, in this particular case, it is very easily understood by the target as an expression of anti-Semitism. So I don't think it is, but we're dealing with a country and a population that has a traumatic history of boycotts being used against it for other kinds of reasons. And so in South Africa, I don't think white South Africans thought the world was anti-white, or that the United States or Canada were anti-white. I do think there are Israelis who believe the BDS campaign is just evidence that the world is a hostile place full of closet anti-Semites. Because of that, I'm not clear it has the desired effect.
And BDS is just a set of tactics. And you can fearmonger around what it does and what it is, but it's a choice. People could choose to do demonstrations, people could choose BDS. There's a litany of things that people could choose to undertake to challenge the inequality and injustice taking place in Palestine. And BDS is just one of them. So I think that's like, so often it gets muddled with what Palestinian liberation might be. That is not over, they're overlapping, but they're not the same.
So speaking from a personal perspective, I certainly think this is a valuable movement. I think the first thing to bear in mind about this movement is that part of the reason it's so important is this is a movement, a tactic, a strategy that is specifically coming from Palestinian civil society. And I think it's important to center Palestinian voices and to listen to what Palestinians themselves think is an effective way of addressing the very real struggle that they're facing.
One of the ways I think that Israel is effective that we can see in the Canadian context is when things like the Gaza invasion happen, you don't talk about the last 80 years. You don't talk about like why Gaza's under siege. You don't even mention that Gaza's under siege. You just talk about self-defense. You talk about this one small incident and you focus everything around it or on these tunnels or whatever. You focus on these small things instead of being like, well, why are there so many people in Gaza? Why does the majority of the population of Gaza not actually come from Gaza? They come from neighboring regions, but were forced there in 48 and 67. Like, you don't talk about colonialism, you don't talk about why groups are in different positions. And I
definitely think it's possible to talk about both humanitarian issues and also about human rights without being anti-Israel. And I think it does a disservice if one starts moving in that direction and moving things. It definitely limits the conversation if one moves it to an anti-Israel kind of a conversation, and I don't think that needs to happen, and in most cases I don't think that it does. You know, by focusing on the humanitarian issues, that's not attacking the state in any way. It's just responding to what happened and the needs there. And again, a human rights approach I feel is useful in doing the same thing by working with a common set of international standards that can point out what all actors in this conflict are responsible for and should be held accountable for. And
I'm looking back at it historically, even when, for example, Theodor Herzl and a lot of sort of like people began sort of forming the idea of a Jewish homeland in Zionism. It was very much a secular idea. The other side of that is calling anti-Zionist activism anti-Semitic, is ignoring, as I said earlier, pro-Palestine Jewish activists, and sort of like erasing that discourse. That's why, for example, a lot of Jewish people may be afraid of speaking out against the occupation for fear of being ostracized from their communities, for fear of being excommunicated, which hasn't happened, especially in Montreal. This may come from the fact that a lot of funding to Jewish communities comes from pro-Israeli lobbies or comes from pro-Israeli companies. I mean, there are a lot of Palestine Jewish collectives in Montreal, for example. You don't have to look very far. PAJU, Palestine Jewish Unity Group, Independent Jewish Voices. All these groups work to sort of erase that idea of the fact that if you're pro-Palestinian, you're anti-Semitic. I feel like that's also calling someone anti-Semitic because they do engage in pro-Palestine activists is a very easy way of shutting down the conversation. It's also a very weak way of shutting down the conversation. So I feel like people who conflate both don't really see the entire history of it or like the entire story of it. Because some would also go as far as to argue that Israel was created as a secular state and not as a Jewish state, or it operated as a secular state and not as a Jewish state, and there's also that aspect of it. So I feel like people sort of need to brush up on their history, and also, I mean, like current secular politics in Israel, and also how the current Israeli Knesset sort of deals with internal Jewish tension. Because there's a lot of sort of Orthodox Jewish tension and secular Jewish tension in Israel as well, right? Especially with regards to the occupation, and also not with regards to the occupation. So people just shouldn't conflate anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Yeah. I would say, and I would say this as someone who is an anti-Zionist Jew, that there is absolutely a way to criticize the Israeli state and what it's doing without going anywhere near a position of anti-Semitism. I think that criticizing colonization, criticizing human rights violations, criticizing all these things clearly has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. I think that's something, that allegation is something that has been used in a very counterproductive and in a very deceptive way by Zionists, by supporters of the State of Israel, to try and quell debate and very, very important criticism, both inside and outside the Jewish community. I think it's important to remember that Zionism is a political ideology that is not the only political ideology within the Jewish community, and especially if you look at the origins of Zionism when it came about. There were at that time very, very active debates and many different positions that were not Zionist being argued over, and I think that kind of spirit of debate is one that should come back a lot more, so that alternatives to what is clearly, to an ideology that's clearly being used in very harmful ways can be brought back into discourse.
There's an occupation going on, and that's really hard to deny. There are facts coming from the ground, from the West Bank, from Gaza. People are being murdered. Scores of people have their houses demolished every day.
So responsibility for violence is not placed on Israel for the occupation and for settlement activity. It's placed on the Palestinians, and certainly Hamas violence is deeply counterproductive, but we're kind of missing, I think we've kind of lost sight of who is occupying who. I don't think that a one-state solution is possible. So there are those who say we should have a one-state solution, resolve it the way South Africa was resolved, but I don't see why Israel established to be a Jewish state would agree to be part of some larger political entity in which Jews were a minority. So that really only leaves us, in terms of solution, with a two-state solution, a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem. We are a long way from that. We're a long way. Last round of negotiations we had, which ended earlier this year, that were brokered by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, were unable to get the parties close to each other on those issues. I think that largely has to do with the current Israeli government taking an even harder line position than its predecessors did. And at the same time, we have continued settlement activity in the West Bank, which makes it's a bit like discussing how you're going to share a pizza, as one commentator once said, whilst one of the sides is eating the pizza. Yeah. So, you know, it makes it physically harder. There are more settlers in the territories. There's more infrastructure to support them, and so on and so forth. So a two-state solution doesn't necessarily address all aspects of the conflict, in particular those Palestinians who were forcibly displaced in 1948 from within what became Israel, have claims against Israel that are not resolved by necessarily establishing a Palestinian state. Many of them would like to go back to their original homes, which is something I don't think is likely to occur. But a two-state solution would certainly resolve the bulk of the conflict and allow Palestine to be, assuming it has control of its borders, a normal state that can trade normally and so on and so forth. I covered a lot of ground. And I am very concerned about the absence of a meaningful peace process right now. I think we are setting ourselves up for decades and decades and decades of conflict that will get harder and harder and harder to resolve. I think the core issue in that is the Israeli occupation and settlement policy. Every settlement that goes in place, every expansion of a settlement, not only geographically compromises the feasibility of a future Palestinian state, but also creates a larger constituency in Israel for settlements.
Any actual change cannot just be let's stop shooting guns at each other or let's stop shooting grossly mismatched weaponry at one another. But like, yes, let's actually make substantial changes where self-determination is something that people will have access to. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
That's it.